Okay, you should be good on that.
All right. Some of the things we're going to go over. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give the subjective slide, and the way I want to frame this this talk and why this method has been so important and useful for me in particular in my community is to give you a very brief insight for those of you outside of medicine into the kind of the state of the science around well-being among healthcare professionals. I work in the healthcare professional well-being space, particularly around medical learners. And to sort of first make this point, I'm going to just jump to one of our more practical resources that's been developed. And to the National Academy of Medicine, which is arguably the sort of one of the overarching academic bodies, if you will, through the US government, has put together this action collaborative on physician well-being. And it's brought together stakeholders from major national organizations, the American Medical Association, our accrediting bodies. So these are a really sort of exciting initiative that has translated to real theoretical impact on our field. And they've got a tool among many in which they've collected a large number of resources, and mostly empiric papers, theoretical papers, et cetera, through which you can search your topic of interest. So I remember when I first saw this a couple of years ago, and I actually just repeated the search yesterday. It's exactly the same as I had it presented. I was just wondering, I wonder what's going to show up when I search for various, elements of the experiences that may influence physician well-being. And so here are the terms that I did, and this is a very non-scientific experiment, but here are the results that I got. Right? So, in fact, of the two papers that showed up for shame, they really weren't that about shame. I can't say I'm not slightly miffed, but none of my papers showed up in this in this search. So I've got emails out to the. But this in many ways sort of exemplifies the state of our science in medicine around what it means to be well or not. It's really dominated by a few sort of 1,000-pound gorillas in the room. And I think there's reasons for that. This is supported in our literature. I'm just going to give you one kind of useful example here. This was a scoping review that looked at studies that address physician and medical learner mental health, and these are the sort of the topics that were covered, the types of distress that were covered. So again, there's a major slant towards burnout, depression, and then the majority of them were quantitative. The vast majority were quantitative or mixed methods. There were very few kind of pure qualitative studies. And that's kind of shown further here that it wasn't just actually the minority were around trying to identify, explain, characterize the nature of these challenges, and most were actually around examining solutions to them. So I had an opportunity to write an article about this, and essentially the take home was we're rushing to solve issues and problems that we've very incompletely characterized and have only characterized through a very narrow sort of ontological and epistemological perspective. And so I really appreciated this quote. Also found it a little amusing. These authors in this paper said that the burnout emphasis is surely warranted. It is. It's a very significant experience. But it may detract attention from those more stigmatized conditions like depression and anxiety. And I read that and I thought, well, yeah, they are stigmatized, but we're talking about depression, we're talking about anxiety, we're diagnosing them, we're developing solutions for them. What about shame, right? Or trauma or abuse, things that our patients and our colleagues and our learners are bringing into our institutions, yet are essentially absent from our conceptualizations, our conversations, and our research. So the last thing I'll do, I love a good soapbox, so I'm on it right now, and I'm just going to make this final point here. This is the Manhattan skyline. I remember flying in recently, seeing these what I think are extremely goofy buildings that they're being put up. They're like luxury high rises, and I thought, that looks familiar. This is how we're building our science. And I'll tell you, if you talk to you read your average burnout paper, especially ones that are getting deeply analytical, quantitatively around burnout, it just feels like we're building up without taking a chance to look around where we are anymore. And I'll tell you, I think, and would argue that shame lies way down deep underneath these constructs. And I think the more we build up, the more we lose the ability and certainly the opportunity to keep sight on it. So another way that we think about this is as we study these important constructs, these important elements of the human experience in healthcare, we're doing it often from afar. We're observing them. We're studying them quantitatively through validated instruments that sort of engender a sense of affective distance from them. I can watch from over here and analyze from over here without having to necessarily share in that experience. Meanwhile, under the iceberg are emotions like shame, which I don't have to convince you of, and then other stigmatized or difficult to measure emotions. And measuring shame, as most will probably agree, is really challenging and complex. As Nikolai pointed out so beautifully, that was an awesome talk, by the way, how complex of an emotional state this is. So the question that follows is, what makes a tool like hermeneutic phenomenology useful for trying to achieve a level of insight and analytical depth, really through proximity, emotional proximity rather than emotional or affective distance? What makes it so effective for studying something like shame? Okay, and so I'm going to take you through that. First, I'm going to attempt to answer what is hermeneutic phenomenology. This was where I started with this when I had a mentor early in my PhD suggest this methodology for me and also say this, I'm going to be pushing you into the deep end with no life raft, and it was very true. But understanding what this is and from where it comes. So I'm going to just give you the briefest of overviews. Are there any philosophers in the room? Only one. If you have questions about this, Luna will answer them for you. So phenomenology, the evolution or history of phenomenology goes back many, many years, but one of the sort of the big inflection points where it came more into sort of the academic space was in the early 20th century. And it was with a guy named Edmund Husserl, and through his sort of ontological revolution. I mean, he was one of the first sort of mainstream or leading philosophers to really push back on the notion that reality can only be understood through objectivity, right? That was a predominant way of thinking and conducting science and teaching at the time. And rather than objectivity being the only way we can understand the true nature of reality, he proposed that there's a critical subjective component to that, right? So Nikolai sort of alluded to this as well, and that reality actually comes about through one's subjective experience of a phenomenon, right? And meaning that it's highly internalized and personalized. And so it really put the attention less on the phenomenon as an objective reality and more one of a subjective nature leading to reality. Okay, and that was a major shift at the time. From this shift came multiple forms of phenomenology, but the two I'm just going to tell you about are transcendental and then hermeneutic. And I tell you about transcendental only because it makes hermeneutics even more understandable. So Husserl really coined and then put forward this notion of transcendental or descriptive phenomenology. And what descriptive phenomenology is based on, the sort of the ontological perspective, is that it's an individual's consciousness and how they perceive a phenomenon that gives rise to the nature of that phenomenon. Okay, so feeling shame is something that I as an individual experience and have consciousness about. And so there's not an objective reality to shame outside of my own consciousness. That consciousness is necessary and critical for the experience and the nature of that emotion. He believed that because we have internalized, we all have a capacity for consciousness, and therefore we all have the capacity to generate realities, that there are universal essences to those realities, right? So that there's something about the experience of shame that does have a universal essence across and among people. And in order to identify that universal essence, we need to maintain transcendental subjectivity. This is where Husserl, to me, seemed a bit confused in his thinking, and this is maybe part of being a revolutionary. He also was apparently a math nerd before he became a social scientist, so it makes sense. But what he believed was that we, in order to understand the universal essences of these lived experiences, that we must remain distant from them as researchers. We have to detach ourselves from our own biases, our own understandings, our own theoretical knowledge, empiric knowledge, so that we can more objectively, with transcendental subjectivity, which is essentially objectivity, understand the phenomenon that we're trying to learn. Okay, now, transcendental phenomenology is a valid methodology now, and it is certainly used. I will tell you, I think for something like shame, that is really difficult, and I'm going to tell you why, and hopefully convince you of why. But I don't mean to present this as throwaway science. This is a really powerful methodology. But if you're going to use it, you have to at least attempt, and he would say you must be able to detach yourself from what it is that you're studying, which is a lived experience. And you're a human who has lived experiences and consciousness, right? You can see the tension there. Okay, so then a guy named Martin Heidegger came along. I think it was a student of Husserl's, maybe. Luna, validate me there. Thank you. And essentially bought into this general ontological perspective, but then started to see where it broke down or where there were tensions and there were problems. And his sort of views evolved more to say that yes, subjective experience is important, but it's really experience within an individual's life world, right? It's not just within an individual's consciousness. It's as they interact with the environment around them, the people around them, historical structures that have shaped them, et cetera. And so reality and consciousness are formed through those interactions. And so if we want to understand or communicate the nature of a phenomenon, we have to understand and try to identify and communicate how that phenomenon is experienced within an individual's lived context. Okay. And that also means that there are no universal essences. There can't be, because everyone's lived experience is theoretically different than one another's. Now, there can be maybe some universal elements or some things that relate to us as people also living in the world. But we're not setting out to figure out what is the universal sort of meaning of this with a more transcendental subjectivity. Okay, this is going to be a more co-constructed subjectivity. That is what hermeneutics is about. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through more about hermeneutics with that background and build this out further to explain how it works, and then continue linking it back to this ontological perspective. So hermeneutics comes from the word from which Hermes also comes. So some Greek word back in antiquity about delivering a message. So the kind of the goal of hermeneutics is to communicate the nature of a phenomenon and its deeper meanings within the context of lived experience. So hence the little Hermes sign here. So the first thing about hermeneutics that arises from this ontological paradigm is that hermeneutics is personal. Okay, this is a great, I paraphrase this quote from a paper that says, a person who turns to hermeneutics does so out of personal engagement. We generally use this methodology, and it's often most effective when we're studying something that we have also experienced or that we are personally interested in. It doesn't mean you have to be, but if you find yourselves wanting to achieve affective proximity and analytical depth about a topic that you have experienced yourself, which is very common in research, this is a methodology that will embrace that personal experience. And that's really cool. Because unlike transcendental and so many other more positivist approaches, which require you to really kind of shield those from your analysis, this brings that personal experience into it. And that's really fun, frankly, and meaningful. So hermeneutics is co-constructive. It comes from the interpretivist paradigm, which is similar to constructivism, in which experience, reality, phenomena are the product of our interactions with the world around us. Okay, and so as interacting beings, I, as a researcher, cannot separate my own experiences from those of yours that I'm studying. And not only can I not do that because I'm inextricably situated in your world too, right? In a different way, but we're all here living together, that to try and bracket those off is actually theoretically impossible, if not really difficult. And so rather than bracketing, and this is what Husserl, the term he used for transcendental phenomenology, we had to bracket ourselves off from the data collection and analysis. We actually break down that bracketing and we bring ourselves into it. such that the product of a hermeneutic analysis is one that has been co-constructed between me, my analysis, my experiences, and you and your experiences and your analysis. Okay, and that's remarkably powerful when it comes to conducting the research. Hermeneutics is therefore, it must be reflexive. So just because we don't bracket away doesn't mean we just freely bring our own biases and experiences and knowledge into data collection and analysis. We have to do it in explicit ways and in open ways. So what this means, and I'll get to this in a little bit, is that when we're analyzing data, we're talking about how does this relate to our own experiences? Is there anything in our knowledge of this construct or this dimension of shame that's coming up here for us? And then we make note of it and we talk about it. And then we always bring it back to the research question and always bring it back to the phenomenon. So we never co-opt what we're learning and put it in our own sort of frame, but we bring our frames into our evolving understanding of the phenomenon as it's expressed by the people in whom we're researching it. Okay. What's nice about this is that in any sort of rigorous qualitative study, there needs to be a reflexivity component. There needs to be a paragraph in there or something that tells the reader from where are you approaching this topic, this research. So when you're practicing reflexivity, you're really doing what I'm saying you do the hermeneutic study. We find that we often do them simultaneously. Hermeneutics is interpretive. So as I kind of mentioned, this is not a methodology that tries to problem solve. It doesn't try to prove anything. It doesn't try to create theory. What it really does is it tries to understand and communicate meaning. Okay, the nature or the shape of a phenomenon and its deeper meaning. And that also differentiates it from transcendental phenomena, which really is just meant to describe. I just want to describe this phenomenon. We're going beyond description with this methodology, and I'll explain how we do that. That is what makes it powerful and makes it really hard. If I'm being honest. So the product, like I mentioned, it's a rich description, and you're going to see how rich this can be of the nature and meaning of the phenomenon and the contextual forces that shape it. Okay. So one of the most powerful sort of tools, methodological tools for doing this is what's called the hermeneutic circle. And I just preview this now, and I'm going to show you how we operationalize it. But the hermeneutic circle asks the researcher to constantly attend to the parts of the lived experience. I kind of come to understand those as the elements, the kind of the building blocks, if you will, that give that phenomenon shape, while continuously attending also to the whole being the deeper meanings, the deeper essences of that phenomenon that make it what it is, that make it different from what it's not. Okay, so what this methodology asks is that you constantly go back and forth between them. So it's unlike many qualitative methodologies where you kind of work through codes and the themes and to meta themes, and you never go back to the codes. This has you continually going back and saying, okay, now that we've gotten this perspective, how can we go back into the data and see how this perspective may align or not, and what we can take from that? All right, so I'm going to just give you an applied example of this, and it's just our research. But I want to caveat this by saying that in the literature about hermeneutics and some of the core writings about it, it's really emphasized that there is not a single way to do this methodology. Okay, so I'm not telling you the way to do it. I'm going to show you a way to do it. What I think is important, having done a couple of different approaches to hermeneutics now, is that you're always making sure that you're aligned epistemologically and ontologically with the paradigm from which this emerged. So that's really important. And it's pretty easy to start kind of trending away from those paradigms. How you apply the methodology is somewhat diverse. Okay. The way that I've done it most, I find to be really, really useful, which is why I'm tell you that. This research for me started when I was a resident. The research didn't start, the interest started. I don't know how many of us kind of woke up one morning and thought, that's it, I'm going to be a shame researcher. In fact, I probably try to avoid being a shame researcher until I can't anymore. And it wasn't even on my radar, to be honest, until I was a resident in family medicine, and I made a really significant medical error in my second year of training. And it happened during the childbirth that I was conducting in an emergency situation where a baby was dying. And I delivered a baby via certain type of delivery, back with a vacuum assisted device. And the baby, fortunately, thank God, survived and did fine, but I really caused a very severe injury in mom. So really severe. And if you want to hear the kind of the down and dirty details of this, our podcast that Luna and I worked on together, the very first episode of that starts with this story, and some emotional detail. The long and the short of it is that I had a massive shame experience coming out of that started immediately at the occurrence of the error and unfolded in a certain sort of shame typical way over the days and weeks that followed. It was really painful and it was very jarring and I was very unprepared for it, despite being a fairly emotionally intact person. And I eventually learned about what it was. It was Brene Brown who did it for me. Her TED Talk at least made it a thing and made it okay. And as a part of my recovery, it was incredible. I just started reading about shame and I probably read some of your articles along the way. Certainly some of the classic shame articles, and I was so blown away, by this emotion's existence and that there was a body of literature around it. And then the near absolute absence of this emotion in terms of its being discussed, acknowledged, talked about, and its presence or absence in our literature in the medical education and medical space. It was like this, Lynn and I kind of call it like a contemporaneous present absence. It's there everywhere, and yet it's absent, right? And so when I had this shame lens now, I was like seeing this all around me and started doing some theorizing about it and writing and then presenting, and then finally somebody kicked me in the deep end and I started researching it. And so this formed my dissertation, which completed last year, and we're actually still doing some work within this data set. But across a series of 3 studies, or four papers, 3 studies, we asked this fundamental question of how do medical learners experience the emotion of shame? And we really came at it from a foundational perspective. We did not want to presume that they experienced it in the same ways that have been described in psychology or in other populations. Their lived context, their lived experience is different. And within the lived experience of medicine and medical education is unique in many ways, and theoretically quite primed for the experience of shame. So we started with residents, actually, internal medicine residents. And in the US, you go through pre-medical studies and your undergraduate and maybe some graduate courses. And then you go into medical school for 4 years. And you have 2 years typically of classroom-based work and then 2 years of clinical work. And then you complete a residency training, which is on-the-job training, anywhere from 3 to 7, 8 years. And then you're out for independent practice. So we first studied this in internal medicine residents who were in the middle of a 3-year program. And then we actually went upstream to medical students and then eventually to pre-medical students because we found so much signal for maybe the origins of shame well before the graduate medical education program. So in each study, we approached this with the same data collection. It was a 2-hour session each time, approximately. We always started with an elicitation technique. So in the first 2 studies, this was a written reflection. In the third study, it was a rich picture. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But we essentially provided a definition or a near definition of shame and asked them to write about a time when you felt shame, and prompted them to consider various dimensions of that experience. There's some nuance to the prompt that I'd be happy to discuss later in the panel, but I won't fall down in it right now. The purpose of the elicitation technique was to ground them back in sort of an experience of shame, so that they weren't sitting down. Hi, I'm Will. Tell me about your shame. That's hard to do, obviously. And it brought some of the details and emotions and reflections back to the surface. I then used that reflection or the rich picture to conduct a one-on-one semi-structured interview that really explored deeply the various aspects of that shame experience. And we used some underlying theory from psychology. The one we used maybe most explicitly was Tracy and Robbins' theory of self-conscious emotion. Really breaks it down very similarly to what you're talking about between the various appraisals and attributions to differentiate shame, guilt, pride, embarrassment, et cetera. And so our interview guide sort of unfolded along some of the lines that the theory would indicate about the emotion. And then we also expanded beyond just that one experience they talked about into their, multiple experiences of shame. And these interviews were really profound. I mean, they were, if you've sat someone down and you've created a safe enough space, even in a research interview, and you've asked them to tell you about your shame, they're going to tell you about some really complex, deep-seated things. And so you need to be prepared for that. And then we did a debrief session that was, 30 or more minutes, also included sort of a mild assessment of their level of distress, how they were doing, provided resources for same day or routine follow-up with psychology, et cetera. Interestingly, very little expressed distress. How much there was felt, I don't know, but most people said, God, I feel actually a lot better, right? There was a catharsis that a lot of people talked about just by participating in the interview, not receiving therapy. These are two examples of rich pictures. I don't have time to talk about this methodology. It's really powerful. The medical education article here is a great primer for how to use rich pictures in qualitative research. But I found it actually even more fun and useful than the written reflections, because there's a lot more to ask about. Why do you have the pathway here? Why is the wall in red? Why are the things on the other side in blue? What are you pointing at? This was a story of a pre-med student who was told by a pre-med advisor, essentially, your grades suck, you'll never make it, you're not going to ever be a doctor. And that with no attention whatsoever to everything else he brought to the table, and no awareness of the fact that he had overcome cancer in college, that he was an immigrant, that he was first generation, that he had overcome an incredible amount of adversity to get where he was. And he was essentially rejected from the field through this advice based on numbers. And then here, just this starkness of, I'm standing outside of the gates of medicine and I'm being shut out, we unpacked a lot about what that means at a self level. So rich pictures, I just wanted to make that sort of plug for them as a really rigorous and awesome methodology. This paper is, the way we have adapted hermeneutics into our analysis. Okay, so these are the analytical steps. They were informed by Rolla Jawi and Joy Higgs. Rolla is a medical educator. She's now at the University of British Columbia, brilliant. And I find this to be one of the more accessible and practical applications of hermeneutics from an analytical perspective. So if you ever want to do this, please make sure to review their paper, because it's one useful way to do it. So I'm going to just show you how we did this in the time I have left, and I'll finish on time. These are the 6 steps that they outline. Okay, don't worry about the big details of this, but there are 6 analytical steps here. And the way we presented these is we presented these in brief narrative form, but we really presented them in tables in each of our papers, because there's so much to report on what we did. What I'm going to do, rather than have you read this table, is I'm going to walk you through the basic steps of this analysis, and then we'll wrap. So what we first did is we generated what are called preliminary first order codes. And the way we did this practically was I is the primary researcher on this, and the interviewer. So really in the interview, I was already analyzing, right? If you've done qualitative interviews, you walk out of there analyzing what you just heard. And then over the subsequent ones, you continue to analyze. So really this was almost the second pass for me, but the first pass for our other research. If you just go through and imagine you have a printed out transcript and you're just reading and you're writing notes in the margin. This seems important, right? Or this is making me think this. You're not trying to code anything, quote unquote code at this point. You're just trying to low level analyze and gain familiarity. Okay, so this is a screenshot from NViva where I did that. This is an example of a margin note here. And it was just some musings, really, more than anything else. Okay, and each of these 6 steps happen iteratively. It's not like you go through all 6 with the transcript and on to the next one. There's an iterative nature to this. In the second step, we then take those sort of preliminary first order constructs and turn them into something a little bit more formal. Now, these are what in qualitative lingo is often called your codes, your initial codes. So we would, for example, instead of saying, I noticed that there's some tension happening here between who she thinks she is and who everybody wants her to be. That code was there's a a personal versus a professional identity tension, right? And so anytime we saw that in the data, we labeled it as such. If there were high stakes, we labeled it as such. So this is an incomplete list, a long list of codes. In the first couple studies, when I was sort of really still learning as a PhD student, I had to go through and define each of those codes, a definition of it, and provide examples, which actually was really helpful for the analytical process because it forced you to think about what do I actually mean when I'm labeling this segment of data, right? That was a really useful analytical step. Over time, I just got better at this and essentially could do that without having to write. From the first order codes on, this is really important. And this is what I think distinguishes this methodology from many other qualitative approaches. We then generate second order constructs. And this is essentially the next level of analysis and the point at which we brought in our own experiences and knowledge. So I brought in my own experiences as a medical student. This was a graphic from some talk I gave that depicts it beautifully, where as I got into med school as a relatively well-rounded normal person. And then as I just laser focused on all that needed to happen to be a good medical student, and eventually a really good medical student, once I realized I could do that, right? As I shed all these other things about myself that were distractions, I just put more and more and more of myself weighted on how I was performing. And I felt really good about that performance. So it was a seemingly constructive thing. So I went through this experience of losing dimensions of myself in service of what I needed to learn and how I wanted to feel good about myself. And we found a lot of that in our study. So that was really relevant, right? As I understood those stories. We brought in, and there were many other ways we brought in our own shame experiences, right? That's just, we brought in existing theory. So the communities of practice, all through there's, theories of ideology, theories of self-concept from psychology. We often would not necessarily formally bring in the theory, but we would reference them. Oh, there's this theory. Let's go read about that a little bit here. Oh, there's something that I learned about this from communities of practice. That's really salient here. Those were brought in very explicitly. And then that generated what we consider second order codes, which are sort of higher level relationships among some of those more elemental codes, the first order constructs. And these are things like shifting identity or performance-based self-esteem, right, which is really in many ways what that depicts. Ideology and its roles, right? So you see the differences here between maybe how shame feels. Now we're going higher to how ideology functions in the experience of shame. Next, you consider, again, this is the deeper meaning. You're going more to the whole of this, okay? So we're having this evolving understanding. What does it mean more fundamentally? And we all constantly ask ourselves that. What is the meaning of this? And that's so often what's not done in a really rigorous qualitative analysis. And that brought us to deeper understandings, such as within a shame reaction in our participants, it was often occurring among a confluence of my prior self, who I was striving to be in the future, the environment, and that yielding a certain sense of self or concept of self in the present. So that shame is not just about how I feel right now, to your point. It's about how my environment's shaping me from where I've come towards which I'm striving. And then finally, we went through the hardest parts of all this, which were the real deeper analysis of the meaning. And we did it through this parts and whole. So here's an example. These are the elemental parts of phenomenology of shame, how it can feel, what it can make us want to do, its physical manifestations. And the whole that underlied this and so much of this data was the destabilizing nature of shame, right? It's an emotional destabilization that often happens. And it can be very minor and fleeting, or it can be really profound. But we found that destabilization, disorientation, depersonalization, emotional vertigo, as it was called by our participants, was a key element of the underlying meaning of shame. We used a lot of metaphor. So there was a participant that said, I feel my sense of self in this last 6 months of struggling feels like I'm holding a really thin glass ball, and I'm holding it really tightly because I can't drop it. But if I hold it any tighter, I'm going to break it, right? And it's this idea of almost like holding a butterfly in your hand, right? You don't want it to fly away, but you don't want to crush it. That notion of whatever she was describing there, right? That's something really fundamental to being in a shame state. Or the notion of dominoes, that this happened to me when I made my error. first domino that fell was you suck as a resident, or you suck as a child deliverer. Now you suck as a resident. And as the dominoes continue to fall, actually you're incompetent as a caregiver. You're incompetent as a partner. These days it will be you're incompetent as a parent. That these concentric dominoes tend to fall, and more of your self-concept is sort of wrapped up in the negative self-evaluation. What that and other deep thinking led to was that when in the shame state, what is often destabilized fundamentally is self-concept, right? It's, you know, and what's so interesting about this is that I didn't know anything about self-concept other than it just out of the dictionary before these data. And we came to this, and then I went to the psychology literature and I was like, holy crap, like this is, first of all, this is nothing new. But secondly, this is exactly what we're seeing. And finally, we use what are called cycles of writing and rewriting. This is the terrifying part of this methodology. This was the first paper, our first research study. This is a snapshot from my file finder and my Mac of all the drafts. We actually wrote 2 different papers, submitted them semi-simultaneously as 2 papers, and they said, write 1 paper. So it went from 2 5,000 word papers to 1 5,000 word paper. And this is where hermeneutics nearly destroyed me. And writing over and over and over. So as I work with learners that I supervise who are doing hermeneutics now, I have to prepare them that when you start writing the manuscript, you're only 2/3 of the way through the analysis. This is not like complete the analysis, now go write it up. And that's important to signpost that, because they feel like, why is this so hard to write? And it's because as you write, you're continuing to analyze, right? And that's what generates the rich layered description. And so what this ultimately led to, as we elaborated these essences more, and this sort of one part of the data I'm telling you about, is that it's that notion of the self-concept as shaped by and within this confluence being fundamentally destabilized and challenged, sometimes altered, chronically or near chronically. And that, so we went from tell me about your shame all the way to self-concept, which then opened up these whole new ways of conceptualizing shame, not just as an emotion, but as a window. Right? Shame actually offers a window into the nature of our experiences that other windows do not afford. And so it's an opportunity and not just an emotion that we need to sort of quote unquote fix or deal with. Okay, and ultimately what this led to, and this is where, in hermeneutics, when it's written about, philosophers will say it's the goal of hermeneutics is to expand what is possible. It's to bring people's experiences out into existence in ways that they may not even be able to bring them out, and then to expand what is possible. So in medical education, we talk about professional identity formation exhaustively. It's studied exhaustively, and rightly so. The process of going from a layperson to a professional, right? And that's a very complex process. Within the huge body of literature around that, there is next to nothing about self-esteem. Insofar as by our literature, you can become a doctor without feeling worthy of being a doctor, and that will be successful identity formation. What we say is, by focusing on self-concept, which considers identity and self-esteem, how we see ourselves and how we feel about ourselves, if we've identified this huge gap in our conceptualization of what it means to become something, which is not just who you're becoming, but how you feel about who you're becoming. And so this has opened up a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about these really complex processes that come from a place of lived experience. All right. The last thing I'll plug, communicating research findings about shame or hermeneutic findings is severely limited by words, right? It's afforded by words, but there's so many more dimensions through which to communicate about this emotion. So just a quick plug for working with creative artists to help communicate some of this. Luna and I have had a privilege of working with some really talented people. One of whom is Hannah Mumby in Exeter, to really bring more dimension and depth to the nature of this experience. And so I'll leave you on my last slide here, and then the next one is we have a website where you can access some of these resources for more reflection. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. So we started a bit late, so we'll just take 5 minutes for a couple of questions. And again, if you have further questions, you can add them to the Slido. The QR code will come back up. So any questions for Will?
I know you're hungry. I will not be offended. I just want to run to the back.
Yeah.
Well, so the question is more like, I'm very, I really like the presentation, it's because you, describe the process of research in general. How you go back and forth, and how, if you go from exploratory approach, I would say that is the research process as a whole. Because it's out learning, doing mistakes, they go back again, understanding more, the visiting poetry culture, understanding in a new sense of language.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment to that. Thank you. It's funny. I've been getting into more philosophical conversations with folks lately, probably because Luna's rubbing off on me, and I'm always a little bit turned off when someone says, no, it can't be that way, right? That's not right. And we're talking about something ontological, about what it means to be. And I think we have an issue in our science where we pin ourselves, or we tether ourselves very tightly to certain ways of knowing and thinking, and think that's the right way or the only way, without realizing that there's no right or wrong way to study things. There's certain ways that may be better fits for certain questions. And so, while I'm very much from a kind of constructivist orientation where this work, and that's how I generally think, we just developed a shame scale, and we're going to start quantitatively studying this from a more positivist orientation. And that's because this approach doesn't allow us to answer certain types of questions that we think are really important for having an impact we want to have with this work. So one of my advisors, mentors, calls it, methodological promiscuity. It's like, it's okay for us to kind of diverge from our camps. And you think about different ways to answer questions that maybe bend our science in new directions.
Thanks very much, Well, yeah, fascinating. I've learned so many new words this morning. It's been amazing. As everybody in this room is interested in shame, and as you alluded at the beginning, it's something that we don't really like talking about. This hasn't occupied a big space in the middle field as well. And I can see and I recognise that you've started to find new ways to communicate it to that kind of wider audience. And I'm interested to know how successful that has been, I suppose, in terms of how much you're able to penetrate those areas of medical education that resisted that, and ideas for the future. So what else is going on in public communication?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll answer as briefly as I can. We've had a lot of success. I've started to appreciate sort of the range, having a range of ways of communicating about this. When I present the grand rounds to the surgeons, I have to be able to talk about this in a certain way. And when I talk to, a group of medical students who are in a humanities course, really wanting to dig in more with the fundamental essences of our work, it's a little bit different there too, versus with the patients. So there's not a single way to communicate about this topic. I think there needs to be some applied ways, and really trying to adopt the language that they're used to hearing. What I universally do across all those groups is I universally use narrative, always my own story, and I try to elevate the stories of others, because that's one of the ways things that define us as humans, is story. And then I try I always try to infuse emotion. I never try to still out emotion. And that might be showing my own emotion, it might be showing the unpleasant nature of some of these experiences. I don't think we need to run away from shame. I've had a lot of people say, can you come to talk, we don't call it shame talk. I'm like, no, I'm not going to come to this talk. That's the whole point here. It's really just to make this a more just normal human emotion that doesn't have to carry so much stigma. But that only is going to start when we stop feeling stigma around ourselves, especially sort of something that's the reception's been really good. Coming up next, we're working now on a study on chain engagement. I screenshotted your one of your slides and sent it to my working with me about how we're sort of identifying where stress and shame integrating versus more constructive shame disintegrating. Form of engagement moment meta learners later very nicely with some of the other things that help. And then we're developing a lot of training. We view this as very applied work. There's really no sense in learning all this if we can't actually help make an impact with it. So that's a big critical process. Thank you so much. Thanks for hanging in there with me.